In this podcast, Dov Zakheim covers a broad range of topics, focusing on the need for strong support to Ukraine, at least until the end of the current fiscal year in the United States in September 2023. Issues discussed include cohesion of Nato, the importance of Swedish and Finnish accession to Nato soon, the likelihood that Putin will seek to reconstitute Russian capabilities during a war of attrition, perhaps lasting several years, hoping for a better situation on the part of Putin, perhaps after a Trump return to the White House, that the use of nuclear weapons or direct military attacks against NATO territory remains less likely. Dov Zakheim is a corresponding member of the Swedish Royal Academy of War Sciences since 2011 and a former writer, businessman and politician. He is a particularly valuable member of the Academy given his focus on lessons learned. In his case, closely related to his service in the Reagan and George W. Bush administrations, in the latter case as Undersecretary of Defense. He took the unprecedented step for a Republican to sign up to a statement in 2020 supporting Joe Biden for president, arguing that President Trump was unfit to serve another term. He has written hundreds of articles and a number of books, including A Vulcan's Tale, discussing missed opportunities and struggles to manage two wars, particularly the seemingly endless conflict in Afghanistan. In this podcast, he appears in a discussion together with Michael Sahlin, also a former State Secretary for Defense in Sweden in the early 90s, and myself, Lars-Erik Lundin, working closely together with Michael on several recent books focusing on Swedish and European security policy, including in the southern dimension and the Russian war against Ukraine. Both Michael and I have a background as diplomats and political scientists associated inter alia with SIPRI, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. In the following clip, Dov takes as his point of departure the cohesion of NATO, which following the Russian aggression is stronger than during several decades. The same applies to the EU. He argues that if Sweden and Finland will not join NATO, this could be taken as a sign of weakness, as a sign of lack of cohesion on the part of NATO, which obviously negatively would affect deterrence. Putin is obviously hoping for something, and that could, in combination with the possible, even if not likely, Trump comeback, encourage the current Russian strategy to dig in a World War I fashion and then try to reconstitute Russian capabilities over the next couple of years, as did Stalin after Stalingrad. This is, argues Dov, an argument that the Secretary General of NATO could and should make.
One of the things that has been a very positive outcome, not just Sweden and Finland entering NATO, but the cohesion of NATO has been stronger than it's been, I'd say in 2 decades at least.
Same applies to the EU, by the way.
Yes. And so, but I don't know that in this case, the EU can't play in this because Turkey, the EU's been messing Turkey around since the 60s. But in terms of the cohesion of NATO, Putin has been seeing this. Now, if Sweden and Finland aren't, and maybe this is an argument that can be made at the Biden level, if Sweden and Finland don't come in, that to Putin could be the first indicator that NATO is not as strong as he thought it was.
Yeah.
Now, why is that important? My view is, and I've been articulating that, and I just wrote something about it, I believe that if you look at what's going on in Ukraine, the Russians are digging in. They're putting in trenches. They're base tank traps. What they're doing is preparing to fight a World War I. Why? Because Putin figures in 2 years Biden is gone. If Biden is gone, he's hoping Trump is back. After all, right now we only have one candidate for the Republicans, and it's a guy named Donald Trump. Now, do I think Trump will get the nomination? Personally, I don't, but that depends on who's against him.
DeSantis?
That's what I'm hoping, but who's a very different character, completely. But if you're Putin and you're already cornered, which you are in a corner, you're hoping for something. Well, your hope is Trump is back. So you dig in for 2 years. And one other thing to remember, and of course, Europeans remember this far better than Americans. In 1941, in September of 41, the Nazis were at the door of Stalingrad. 3.5 years later, the Soviets are inside Berlin. The Russians can reconstitute. This idea that that because of embargoes and sanctions and all this, that it'll take them a decade is nonsense. The Russians reconstituted when they were in much worse shape. And so, again, Putin knows this. Putin knows the history. And so for him, waiting it out for 2 more years while he reconstitutes, and in the hope of a Trump coming back, that's a strategy. Now, if you add on top of that, Finland and Sweden not coming, maybe you won't come in for 2 years. What does that tell them about NATO cohesion? And then all it takes is, the Germans saying this is too much for us, or 2 bad winters, or whatever. And Putin feels, he's still going to win. So in a sense, not having Sweden and Finland come in relatively soon further increases in Putin's mind the sense that, at the end of the day, he's going to win out. And I think that's an argument that needs to be made. And oh, by the way, that's a great argument that Stoltenberg can make as the Secretary General of NATO.
It's so great an argument that it's surprising that it hasn't been made already and forcefully, because it's so obvious, at least to me, that this is
that's the
great
old problem.
situation.
It's the problem with things that are obvious.
Yeah.
In the second clip, I refer to Dov's writings about the lack of clarity in his view of the US national security strategy and lack of clarity when it comes to its approach to Ukraine integration into Euro-Atlantic structures. Against this background, I refer back to an earlier podcast about escalation risks made by Michael and myself. Also in Sweden, we should brace ourselves for the need for crisis management during 2003. You are on record in some of your contributions to worry about the lack of clarity of the security strategies in the US and the defense and everything that follows, that it isn't clear enough in terms of deterrence. And you're also on record for us in the West not being clear enough about our intentions about Ukraine. You think one should send the signal that Ukraine should get into NATO and so on. We have on our side, Michael and I, just try to speculate about when you talk about escalation. We heard Stoltenberg worry about escalation. Our commander-in-chief has also worried about escalation. So we did a podcast about that, trying to point to the many dimensions of escalation. What we're trying to say is that a lot of things could happen during next year that would perhaps merit the type of press conferences that we have right now in the Swedish government. We had one yesterday saying that we were very close to an energy crisis in Sweden the other day when we had to import equivalent of 3 nuclear power plants of energy from we were almost at the limit that we had to start rationing. And so a lot of things could happen with cyber, with water, with energy, with electricity, with terrorist attacks, what have you, inside the country. So we have to brace ourselves and get into a crisis mode in the way we were in a crisis mode during the pandemic, and we were managing to mobilize the country and the population to suffer quite a lot of inconveniences, so to say. So one has to square this picture of digging into the trenches in the First World War situation for another 2 years, with the possibility that even during that period we could experience very unpleasant things. The Finns are, of course, relatively convinced for the time being that the ground presence of Russian forces has been greatly reduced along the Finnish frontier, of course. But there are so many other things that could happen that merit, vigilance on our side. We are, of course, arguing, and that is natural, that is a Swedish and a Finnish argument, that already the fact that we have applied for membership in NATO and that this has been welcomed through bilateral assurances of support from the Brits and from the US and others who are very important to us, has put us in a much better position then. And that we are working full steam ahead to try to get us interoperable with, and we are starting to understand better what it means to be interoperable and integrated into NATO structure once that's happening. But it's not an optimal situation, as you just said. We are sort of in, and we don't want to give Putin ideas, of course. And we don't think that we are, I think, what I hear from our military colleagues, particularly the Air Force people, is a certain sense of confidence that we have a good Air Force situation, potentially, perhaps already now, but certainly in a medium-term perspective. We have F-35s all around. We have a very interoperable system in Sweden.
In the north, yeah,
in
the Nordics.
But I mean, I think it's important to visualize the things that could happen during this First World War period, drawn out possible period, because I certainly believe that what you have said is also the sense of our Sovietologists, the people who have studied the past, that this is a country which always seemed to have reserves. There is always some reserves left in the Russian system, and they are able to come back. So sometimes we overestimate them, as we did at the end of the Cold War and as we did before the 24th of February. But sometimes we seriously underestimate the ability of the Russian people to take a beating, a long, protracted suffering in order to do something which they, in the end, perhaps believe that they have to do. In the next clip, Dov concurs with this forecast, that there will be pressures on Finland and Sweden as long as they are not formally admitted to NATO. The Russians may be weaker, close to Nordic borders, but they have other means. So,
yeah, no, you're absolutely right. My concern is that there will be pressures on Sweden and Finland. The longer that Sweden and Finland are not in NATO, the more of a target you are for special Russian pressures. And it's true that they've moved troops from facing Finland to back down to Ukraine, and they have a problem with their troops generally. I mean, that's why they're recruiting all these fresh, raw young men, and now they're checking homes and doing all kinds of things. But they have other means, as you say.
Here, Dov points to the fact that Sweden and Finland do not have a nuclear umbrella. Sweden had such a nuclear umbrella even in the 70s, but it's not clear that it exists today, and even less so for Finland. This increases vulnerability. Quoting Churchill, saying to the Americans that the European disease may spread to the United States, weakness in the north can spread to the south and to the west. That is why NATO is united now.
And the longer that this hiatus persists, where Putin knows that you're coming in, but you haven't come in, that gives him an opportunity. Because at the end of the day, one of the big things about coming into NATO is the nuclear umbrella. And you don't have a formal nuclear umbrella until you're in. And that already opens you to pressures that might not otherwise be taking place. Now, Years ago, I gave an interview to Dagens Nyheter about the nuclear umbrella that we gave actually Olof Palme while he was busy attacking us over Vietnam. But it's not clear that you've got that nuclear umbrella today. Mm. And therefore, and certainly Finland doesn't have it. Finland never had it. And so Putin knows that. And the longer this thing drags on, the more vulnerable you are to the kinds of things you're talking about. Yeah. Cyber, terrorism, whatever it might be. I mean, look, the FSB has a big bag of tricks. They've always had a bag of tricks, and it could be very bad indeed. So that's, in fact, another reason, beyond what I was saying earlier, that it's imperative, because if he's successful in doing some things to undermine Finnish cohesion, Swedish cohesion, it's not going to stop there. Churchill gave, again, I've quoted this. Churchill, when he gave that famous speech in December of 1941, after we were hit by Pearl Harbor, he gave a speech to the joint session of Congress like Zelensky did last night. And one of the things he said to the Americans, to us, to Congress, was, look, you can have the disease that starts in Europe, but eventually it'll get to you, because it always does. And the same applies. The disease, if Putin tries to inject some kind of disease into Sweden and Finland, it's not going to stop with Sweden and Finland. Everybody knows it won't. That's why NATO is united now. And so, again, a perceived lack of cohesion, a perception in Moscow that the cohesion is falling in part, invites the disease, not just in Sweden and Finland.
Against this background, Michael draws the conclusion that NATO accession issue needs to be resolved at the latest in March. At the same time, Sweden and Finland cannot do more in terms of concessions.
Whereas we and Finland, but perhaps especially we, were quite concerned back in May, June, at the risk of being stuck in this hiatus, as you say, between our decision being formalized and acceptance of NATO ratification. There has been more relaxed attitude to this now compared to then, not because of simply accepting the fact that it has been dragging on. Although Stoltenberg keeps saying that, but this is faster than any earlier enlargement step. Well, that's not a big thing to say, because of course it should be quicker. We are so ready in all respects, as we know. But it's also the fact that things that Putin said last summer, let's say, surprising some that he wasn't more angry about this step, somehow just shrugging and saying that, yeah. And this, to the extent that anyone takes that as some kind of, if not guarantee, then at least a measurement of it's not so dangerous after all. I think it's a big risk of overstating or overinterpreting the fact that he wasn't more sort of upbeat about this, because he sees long lines, and he will show his teeth when he's ready for that, and we should prepare for that. So whatever you have been, all the things that you have been saying combined, and what Lars-Erik was saying, convinces me now that it would be imperative to see to that this thing is solved in March at the latest, lest it risk dragging on for a long time, and then it's completely unacceptable from a NATO point of view. And what it takes to achieve that, but timing is of essence here. But I really think that if it takes longer than that, then you are facing exactly the risk that you are talking about now, and then the question becomes: so what? We cannot do more by way of concessions.
Michael then puts a question about the risk of escalation. Dov's response initially by saying that he's much less worried about escalation to World War III. A number of red lines in this regard have not led to escalation to the NATO-Russia level. Western capabilities to respond, both on the nuclear level and in terms of cyber, are at least as strong as Russia's. Putin does not survive a conflict with NATO. The key issue whether Biden and Congress can push through a big enough support package to Ukraine, including tanks, etc. As it looks now, there should be money coming to Ukraine for etc. As it looks now, there should be money coming to Ukraine for a month to the end of the current fiscal year.
Step-by-step action reaction. Are we proceeding towards NATO openly clashing, not just by way of proxy, but more openly, as Stoltenberg and others have warned in recent days? I mean, we talk about the First World War kind of struggle, but we are also talking about the risk of World War III, aren't we? So where do you sense that we are in those terms?
Well, I'm much less worried about a World War III. A couple of reasons. First, do you recall when we were saying, more than anyone else, oh, if Ukraine hits inside Russia, there'll be World War III. Well, guess what? They've hit. If Russia considers Crimea part of Russia, and it's not only Crimea that's being hit. No World War III. We said, oh, if we transfer HIMARS to the Ukrainians, God, that could bring on World War III. No World War III. We're not sending all that many Patriots, sending one battery. We should be sending a lot more than that, by the way. And oh, by the way, the Germans have Patriots too, and they could ship them. I don't think there'll be a World War III over that. I don't think there'll be a World War III over tanks. One of the reasons I say that is Putin knows that if he does anything with NATO, he risks a nuclear war himself. Does he preempt with a nuclear weapon? I don't know that he gets away with that. And look, without going into any kind of detail, he knows we have a capability at least as good as his when it comes to cyber. Look what we did to the Iranians with Stuxnet, and how many years ago was that now? So if his whole, he's got two objectives. Objective number one is to defeat Ukraine and win it all back. Objective number two is actually more important to him than objective number one, which is to survive. He doesn't survive a World War III. He doesn't survive a conflict with NATO. So I think this worry may be overstated, seriously overstated. And if we had, and I'm firmly of the view that if we had listened to Zelensky in March of this year and shipped Patriots then and shipped HIMARS then, I don't know that this war would still be going on. So what did he ask for last night? He specifically asked for tanks and aircraft, which he's asked for before. And he made a very pointed statement. He said, our people don't need to that long to be trained on these things, because that's been the argument. Oh, it'll take them 2 months. Well, if we'd shipped tanks 2 months ago, they'd have them now. So the real issue isn't, in my view, World War III. The real issue, in my view, is can Congress and Biden push through a big enough financial support? You know, right now, there's an appropriation that is, if it's passed, which it should, will give them another $45 billion. That's going to spend out over, I don't know, I think till May or June. Maybe not June, but certainly April, May. So they'll have enough coming in for the next 5 months. But they're still going to need more. And you've got these 30 isolationist Republicans in the House who could force the Speaker, probably McCarthy, but we don't know that because of them. We don't know if he'll get it. Who could force the Speaker to refuse to give any money or minimal money to Ukraine. What people need to understand, though, is whenever the House says one thing and the Senate says another thing, they have to have what's called a conference. And one side gives in to the other, or they negotiate in the middle. The people who will be on the conference for anything to do with armed services tend to be the most moderate Republicans from the House. The Senate side, we know, will support Ukraine without a question. So when they have the conference, Ukraine will get money. Maybe not 100% of the money that the Senate might give, but I would guess even more than 50%. So there'll be more money coming. That's my sense of it. So I can be wrong, who knows? But right now, as I see it, there should be money coming to support Ukraine, certainly through the end of our fiscal year, which is next September 30th.
Dov then points to the fact that there are NATO troops posted to the Baltic states. Putin therefore cannot afford escalation in that direction. Putin is not delusional in his view.
What do you mean by escalation? If he escalates against NATO, say with cyber, he runs the same risk.
Yeah.
Okay. If he doesn't have the wherewithal, the troops to actually move, I would say even into the Baltics. And if he does try that, remember, we, the Canadians, the Germans, we've got troops there. What's he going to do? Start shooting Americans, Germans, and Canadians and so on? It's not going to happen. French. So what else could he do? He's doing everything he can to totally destroy Ukraine, to turn Ukraine into Grozny. He's already doing that. So to me, the only escalation is some kind of nuclear activity, and I don't think he'll do it. He's actually said he wouldn't because, well, one thing about Putin, I don't think he's delusional, and I don't think he's stupid. He's living in a world that doesn't give him full information because his people won't. But that's not delusional. That's a little different. He's not, and he's certainly not stupid. If he was stupid, he never would have gotten to where he got. So I really do believe him that he's not going to go nuclear. I don't believe him when he brushes off Sweden and Finland and says, oh, it's no big deal. That, I think, was more to relax everybody and have people focus on other things, quite frankly. So the issue to me is, does Congress come through with the money? Because clearly that's what Zelensky needs. And does the administration come through with heavy armor? I'm not talking about aircraft. Aircraft is much harder. But with heavy armor, which he's also asked for, and which they could train for. And to me, and again, I've written this, and I don't know if it'll be published, but that's much more important than all these congressmen and senators standing up and applauding him. Applause doesn't win you anything on the battleground.
I then refer to the intimate knowledge of the areas close to St. Petersburg, Leningrad, already on the part of Stalin, and now certainly also on the part of who comes from Leningrad. For him, Sweden and Finnish accession clearly constitutes a major geopolitical change. On the nuclear issue, Russia also has to take into account the risk of losing deterrence effect if sub-strategic nuclear weapons are put to use in Ukraine. The result should be a much greater Western. On the issue of Sweden and Finland, I was posted to Finland in the early 80s, so I was had a lot of lonely evenings to study and read Finnish literature. And what impressed me most, perhaps, was the intimate knowledge with Finnish geography that Stalin had.
Yes.
And now we have a president in Kremlin who has been posted not only to Germany, but also, importantly, comes from Leningrad.
Yes.
St. Petersburg. for him, this is an important part of the world. I think exactly like you, that he's not dismissing the importance of this geopolitical change, because he also sees perhaps a little bit into the future what could happen in this rather long border district to Russia. If you measure in Europe as a whole, almost the half of Europe from north to south is suddenly becoming direct border to Russia. So that's the one thing. The other thing with the nuclear weapons, what I thought, having tried to understand a little bit more about nuclear things when I did the study for the Swedish government on the treaty on the prohibition, was that once you use nuclear weapons on the tactical level or the sub-strategic level, then you lose something very important. You lose this sort of the sense of that this is the doom. You lose some of the deterrence effect. And at the same time, I would assume that you solidify, you create a steel wall on the NATO side, and that then really coherence and unity is solidified. And you would also give a strong adrenaline kick to the Chinese and Indian leadership. What's going on here? Is everything we are doing in trying to influence through commercial and other policies to the Belt and Road policies, all of that will be lost if we have a nuclear situation. So I don't know what you say about these two.
Well, I agree with you on the second point. I would simply add to your first point. Look, Turkey also has a long border with Russia. The thing about and you're absolutely right about Putin's somewhat obsession with the North. Look, who's his hero? Peter the Great. What did Peter the Great do? Peter the Great was the one who essentially created St. Petersburg into a major city.
Yeah.
Peter the Great was the one who began the movement to create the Baltic Sea as a Russian state, as a Russian sea. And this is his hero. And so, and of course, I'm sure you know that he took the archives out from under the Ministry of Culture and put it in the presidential office. And he's been obsessed with all these Russian agreements and treaties and so on. This is what he wants to restore. But if you're focusing on Peter the Great and not on the czars who, took over Kazakhstan or something, that tells you where he's really looking. So I totally agree with you on that. His focus is going to be your part of the world. By the way, when did Sweden stop fighting? When it fought with Russia. So,
I mean, the fact that we haven't had a war in Sweden for 200 years doesn't mean that we couldn't come back with having a considerable defense morale.
Well, absolutely.
The second point is, in this context, just to finish, Michael, this small sort of excursion, is that there is a link between the two for me. And that is the historical memory of Leningrad being in rubble, being destroyed during the Second World War. So having a nuclear sub-strategic exchange, which is not too far from St. Petersburg, I think would be a very unpleasant thought for.
No, I agree. I don't think he's going to do it. But I do think that, as you say, he's obsessed. If he's obsessed at all, let's put it this way, he's obsessed with restoring. He doesn't talk about Stalin. He talks about Peter the Great. And so that's what he wants to restore. This Russian empire.
Really?
And the Soviet Union collapse, he says it's the worst thing that happened in the 20th century. I think he sees it not as the Soviet Union collapsing, but as the Russian Empire collapsing. And that's what he wants to restore. And frankly, if I were living in Sweden and Finland, I'd be nervous. Very nervous.
If you were living in Estonia, would you be nervous too?
No kidding. Of course. The only difference, and this is why it's so important to get you and the Finns in, is Estonia and the Baltic states, small as they are, they've got NATO troops in them. I'm not saying you need the NATO troops, but they're so small they do need the NATO troops. They've got this new Polish brigade that's clearly geared, the American brigade in Poland, I should say, clearly geared to operations in the Baltic states. And they've got the nuclear umbrella.
And some tripwire additions.
That's what I said, tripwires.
Yeah, you said that.
American troops, so on. So it's important that you may not need the tripwire. As Lars-Erik just said, you guys have a pretty strong military and you're strengthening it even more. The Finns, they seem to be able to handle themselves pretty well. You've got the Nordic cooperation. You're getting tighter with Norway, tighter a little bit with the Danes. So that's good. You don't need what the Baltics need on the ground necessarily. One of the things that Putin has to have noticed is that the Marines are doing more and more exercises in the Baltic. And I've spoken to the Commandant of the Marine Corps about this and to the Chief of Naval Operations. That's going to continue. There are going to be more exercises with your forces. There'll be, obviously, that is a threat to Kaliningrad right there. So we know that it's bristling with missiles and all that, but they're not going to make it.